Hi, this is Brad Linder with Liliputing, and I have here a new device called the Primer Pocket by Skytex. It's a handheld Android device, sort of like an iPod Touch or a smartphone, but unlike a smartphone, doesn't have a data plan, doesn't make phone calls, and unlike the iPod Touch, it's dirt cheap. iPod Touch usually starts at around $200. You have to pay a monthly plan to use something like a smartphone. This guy here, it's bigger, it's bulkier, it's got cheaper components, but the advantage is it sells for under $100. The suggested retail price is around $99. You can look around and probably find one for as little as $89. For that price, I mean, what you get is, as I mentioned, a lot bigger, a lot bulkier, and not as fast. It's got a 600 megahertz MIPS processor. Not all Android applications run on a MIPS processor, so that causes some problems. The screen resolution is 480 by 272. It's about the same as the Sony PSP. Some applications don't like that screen resolution, and it's a resistive touchscreen display, which means that you're probably going to have to use the back of your fingernails instead of your fingertips to interact with it. That said, it plays videos quite nicely. Certain apps run pretty well, and it does support multi-touch gestures like pinch to zoom. It's got a micro USB port, a micro SD card slot, headphone jack, a series of buttons here, speaker, which is reasonably loud and clear, microphone, which I haven't really tested yet, and an on-off button, home, menu, back, and volume buttons. Now, while some tablets place these awkwardly on the back where you can't really find them and see what you're doing, here, once you get used to the idea of which buttons where, you can see them from the front, or when you're holding it in your hand this way. So even though you don't necessarily see the labels unless you're looking at the back, it's pretty easy to remember menu button, back button, home button, and to use this without necessarily thinking too hard about what you're doing. Skytex sent me this unit to review, and I've had it for about a day. Haven't really put it through all of the trials and tribulations just yet, but I can tell you that as far as a handheld device goes, you get a lot more bang for your buck if you spend more bucks, but it's an interesting little inexpensive device for people who are on a budget but want something to do a couple of basic features. One thing that I'll start off, because there's kind of a lot of negative to look at. Let's start with something positive. It actually does a really great job for such a cheap device at handling video. So if you use this as pretty much nothing other than a portable media player, it does a pretty good job. I've put two DivX videos on here, and both of them play beautifully, even though one is a 720p high-definition video, and the other is a standard definition video. So I have no complaints really in terms of the video, other than the fact that, as you can see, the colors sort of wash out if you don't look at it directly from the front. From the side, it just looks like a black screen. So there's your video playback, and that's probably one of the best things about the device so far. It doesn't come with the Android market. Instead, you get the GetJar market, comes preloaded. You can use that as basically a web-based marketplace for downloading apps and installing them. I installed SlideMe in the Amazon App Store to try some different things. And certain applications I was able to download, but I was not able to properly run. So, for instance, Doodle Jump installed, but it doesn't play properly. Wixel Lite was one of the first games that I tried to install. This is a word game which does not like the screen resolution. It's supposed to give you 4 grids, or a 4x4 grid of letters, and you find words, but you can see the bottom grid actually just doesn't display fully. Same thing happens if you go and change the screen orientation. So that pixel resolution is a problem. It's a problem that the folks at Skytex are aware of, and they're reaching out to the software makers to see if there's anything that they can do to fix that, so that the handful of applications that don't fit the screen properly might be able to be sort of forced in to work better. Other applications like Angry Birds, this app runs, but it runs kind of slowly. So the frame rate is not quite perfect, makes it a little bit difficult to aim, as you can see. So you can play games, but the experience is going to be better on some games than on others. As I mentioned, certain applications didn't install. I tried installing the TuneIn radio application, didn't work. Tried a couple of other radio apps, didn't work. I did find one called RadioBee, which works actually quite nicely for finding shoutcast radio stations, and the folks at Skytex told me Pandora also works. I haven't tested that yet. Tried the Aldico and FB Reader apps for reading ebooks. Neither of those worked, but Moon Plus does work properly, as does the Kindle application. Real quick here, just to show you the Newsweek application, so you can sort of see what it would be like to use this for reading text, whether it be newspapers, magazines, and so forth. So it's not quite instantaneous here, but once the page loads, pretty smooth scrolling, and you can fit a fair amount of text on the screen. Now, apps are kind of the way to go here, because when you go to the web browser, it works, but it works really, really quite slowly. So here we are just trying to load the Google web page, which there's almost no page on the web that loads more quickly than Google, but you can see how much time it's taking here. And now it's fully loaded. So let's try the New York Times. I find typing is pretty difficult on a display like this with a resistive touchscreen technology. It's easier to type with one thumb than two. And at times I find that my thumb sort of hits the wrong button, or what I think looks like it should be hitting the right button, but it doesn't. You can calibrate the screen using the settings, which means that if you've noticed that every time you press one button a different one triggers, you can just go in and tell the screen that it, or tell the device that it's doing it wrong, and fix the screen calibration to a certain degree. So pages that are formatted for mobile like this load reasonably well. Pages that are not formatted for mobile, I've noticed, can take a really long time. Let's go to the So you can see the basic page is loaded, but it's still having problems loading the thumbnail pictures here. And this is a page that normally loads in seconds on other mobile devices. So while we wait for that page to load, to sum up, Skytex Primer Pocket, it's pocketable, works pretty nicely as a relatively inexpensive mobile media player. It's got 4 gigs of storage, 2.6 gigs are basically available to the end user when you first get the device. You can expand that with an SD card if you need extra space. If you're looking for a device for surfing the web, this will do it, but it's really not a great experience, and you'll probably find yourself pretty frustrated if you try to use it too regularly. But for reading ebooks, running certain apps, it's not too bad. It's the sort of device where it's kind of tricky, because on the one hand I think it's geared towards people, look, it loaded, it's geared towards people who are interested in the Android experience but don't want to spend a lot of money. But it's probably going to be even more frustrating for those people than for people who are familiar with the full Android experience, because it's not a great first experience. If you know what you're doing, you can sort of find ways to tweak things. Anyways, this is Brad Linder at Liliputing and the Skytex Primer Pocket.